Okay. So what I was going to cover today was pesticide toxicity and safety. I know this isn't a real flashy topic, but it's important. I mean, it's one of the reasons why we have to get certified to use pesticides in our work, particularly restricted use pesticides. And a lot of times people saying, "Oh, I understand pesticides. This isn't that important." But I'm one of those people. I'm sort of a pesticide geek in that I read lots of studies, and some of the studies that I read deal with what are the effects of long-term exposure on people with pesticides, and there's been a number of studies that they'll look at uh, cohorts of people, groups of people over 25 or more years, and they'll ask people to rate their pesticide exposure. Was it low, medium, or high? And then they look at, are there associations with changes in incidence of certain diseases or cancer with those people. And there's also all sorts of things, liver cancer, thyroid, lymphomas, and things like that. And I've read a number of these studies where they have found some changes in these incidences. It's hard to say it's due to the pesticides, but there is an association there. And one of the things that I see is that generally people who have had long-term exposure to pesticides but have rated their exposure as low or moderate, those groups often don't have an association with increases in health risks due to pesticides. But the group that rates their exposure as high to pesticides, there sometimes are increases in some of those incidences in some of those health effects, and not huge, but there are measurable increases in some of those. And so the take-home message for me, at least, is I don't want to be in that category of having high exposure. And that's one thing as pesticide applicators, we have control over how much exposure we have to pesticides. So we need to think about how to minimize our exposure, and I'm going to talk about some of that this morning to keep ourselves in that low to moderate group and not get those chronic high exposures to pesticides. I think there's a lot to be said about that, and well, let me go ahead and address that here in a few minutes. So before I get started with everything, let me just say that there are some changes going on right now. It's interesting. I was looking at these pictures, and it's like, well, there's probably 70 years difference between these pictures, and they're looking almost exactly the same. So everything's changing, but everything stays the same, so to speak. But one of the things that's changing right now is pesticide certification. The rules. And let me show you what's going on. And the EPA initiated all these several years ago. Actually, about 8 years ago, they said there's going to be new rules in terms of certification and training of pesticide applicators. And we've been working through those, and we're getting very close to getting those approved by the EPA. Some things that you're likely to see when these are finally approved. And I expect these to be approved by November of this year, and we'll be operating under a new set of rules. The last time the rules changed for us was 1978. So this is really a big deal. It's going to affect how we certify, recertify people in Kentucky to use restricted use pesticides. One of the things you're going to see is the CEU hours, how those are recorded. In the past, you've had to get 9 hours of general CEU credit and 3 hours of category specific every 3 years. Well, the 12 hours every 3 years is going to stay the same, but they're doing away with general CEU hours. They're going to expect that every category specific hour has general content. So they're actually streamlining it, and you as applicators, you don't have to keep up with general or specific hours. It's just you need to get the hours in your category. So we're going to see that moving through. A few other things that are changing. In the past, we could have people less than 18 that were certified. We cannot anymore. The only exception would be for private applicators if there's a family member that's 16 years old or older, and there is another private applicator in the family. Now you will have to show a valid government issued ID to be certified. So you have to present an ID and prove who you are to get certified. We're going to keep the 3-year cycle for recertification. And then in some of the categories, there has to be specialized certifications, but that really doesn't apply to right away. But particularly fumigation and aerial application are going to require specific certifications, and so those are some changes. So let's talk a little bit about health and safety issues here. So what are some different ways we can get exposed? What's going on in this picture? Basically the guy's trying to clean out a nozzle, and I don't know, depending upon the type of sprayer he's using, that line can be under pressure. And so you can see when if he takes off that nozzle, spray's going to gush out, or maybe it's going to come out the nozzle itself and potentially squirt him in the eye. And so, a lot of what we do with pesticide application is just using common sense. And I'm the first to say that that they named common sense incorrectly. It's not common at all. So, think about what you're doing. Think about, are you increasing exposure? Here's another example. What's wrong with this picture? Not a great use of a respirator there, but not only do you have to wear a respirator, but you have to wear it correctly, wear the correct type of a respirator to prevent exposure. Actually, I see this a lot, in terms of skin exposure. People, it's hot. They're going out there, they're applying pesticides, they're going to stay cool. This is one of the things that EPA does not say, but when there is no personal protective equipment listed on the label, the EPA assumes that the minimum people are going to be wearing would be shoes and socks. This guy has that covered. Long sleeve shirt, doesn't have that, and long pants. So if there's nothing on the label, the EPA is assuming you're using that. Oh, and I should also mention gloves. So yeah, we need to think about how to minimize these exposures. And I know it's not always comfortable. I'm out there spraying fields. I do a lot with backpack sprayers. I'll be wearing, the same gear that I tell other people to wear. I believe in being an example for other people. So, this is the last example I have. What's wrong with this picture? The guy, obviously with the palm trees, this is not from this country, but someone's filling a sprayer from a well right there, has his drinking water right there. Whatever he pours in there is going to splash into that cup. And so, that's a situation where you can get ingestion exposure. So, use common sense. There's a lot of ways that we can very quickly reduce our exposure to pesticides. And by the way, I mentioned those studies that, have been done over, 25, 30 years and where they've seen some of those increases. A lot of those pesticides that they studied back then are not on the market. Some of them are like, Lindane and some of these other products have been pulled off over time. But the newer products we have on the market, it's going to take a while before we have 25, 30 years worth of experience with them. So just because we're not using those products that were in some of those studies doesn't mean that we still need to be careful with some of these newer products. And so I just think, if it's a pesticide, treat it with respect, and you will be fine. So, when it comes to effective pesticide use, the only reason why we use pesticides would be to kill something, to kill a pathogen that causes disease, kill insects that harm plants, to kill weeds, on the sides of a highway. And just keep in mind, you just can't use a pesticide and expect it's going to work. You need to use the correct product. You need to apply it at the right time. You need to get good coverage, and you have to get it at the right rate. If you mess up on any of those, it's not going to work as well. And, a lot of herbicides are going to have specific target weed stages. I know you all don't use fungicides very much, but fungicides are only used preventively. Once you can see symptoms of disease, it's too late. You can't kill the disease in the plant. You can only kill a pathogen before it infects the plant. And then insecticides are a little bit different. We can use those preventively, or we can react to insects being on the plant and apply them then. So pesticides come in different formulations. Formulations are very important. Granules, generally we're only using those for soil applications. The only difference would be the water dispersible granules. Those are the ones that dissolve in water. We use those for broadcast or foliar applications, but you're probably familiar with a lot of these. ECs, if you've been around for a long time, a lot of the older products, almost all of them used to be the emulsifiable concentrate. So sort of a clear tainted solution. When you mix it in water, turns milky white. We're seeing fewer of those. A lot of the newer products now are going to be the soluble concentrate. So they mix with water a lot more easily. Flowables, we do have a few microencapsulated products. Those provide extended release over time. And there are a few products that are liquids out there. Why it is important to understand formulations is, particularly if you mix different pesticides together in the spray tank, the formulation, the order that you mix things depends upon the pesticide formulation. And so if you are mixing things, read the label, look at the mixing order, and that will make sure that things get into solution properly and you don't end up with a glob of something in the tank. So toxicity, what determines the toxicity of a pesticide? A lot of it is the active ingredient. How toxic is that active ingredient? Is it an active ingredient that's very selective and not very toxic to us? We have a number of pesticides that have low toxicity to mammals. Or is it a product that has high toxicity to us and other non-target organisms? The other factor is that how concentrated it is. It may be a very toxic material, but once we dilute it, we dilute it 1,000 or 10,000 fold with water, its toxicity goes down enormously. So that's another thing to keep in mind. But if you're someone that's mixing the pesticides, when you're working with that concentrated solution, keep in mind it is much more toxic than the dilute solution. So, so how do we get exposure when we're using pesticides? One of the first ways is when we're handling open containers or even used containers. A lot of times when we pour out of a 2.5 gallon jug, you may get a few drops running down the end of the container. That's a potential exposure. When you handle those containers, how do you reduce exposure? You use gloves. When you're mixing and loading concentrates into a spray tank, you may be pouring them into a measuring container, then pouring them into the tank. Any splashing, any spilling that occurs there, you're dealing with a concentrate. So that's a high exposure potential situation there. When you work around contaminated application equipment, you haven't had a chance to clean the equipment yet. You may be dealing with plugged nozzles, leaking lines, filters that have to be cleaned. That's another high potential exposure situation there. When you're making the applications, when you're spraying, particularly, not every day is the perfect day for spraying. Sometimes you get mist or winds and breezes that come along. You get blowback from those sprayers. Trust me, I've been in those situations. Those are potential exposure situations. Fortunately, you're working more with diluted materials at that point. And so, the potential exposure is a little bit less, but you might get that more often. So it can add up over time. Cleaning up spills. If you've been doing this long enough, you will have spills. I've had spills. I remember we got a new pesticide storage facility on campus. I thought it was great. All these stainless steel shelves and all this. And I was the one that was moving all the pesticides in this building. One of the first jugs I put onto the shelf, I slid it over, and all of a sudden I started noticing a fluid linking out on the shelf underneath the 2.5 gallon jug. I didn't realize they had self-tapping screws that went right through the shelf. And when I slid that jug on the shelf, it cut right through the bottom of the container and it was leaking on the shelf. And so spills happen. You have to know what to do. And you have to react quickly to some of that. And it's a high exposure situation. And then lastly, going back into an area that's just been treated, and particularly before the spray is dried, you're going to get the exposure to some of the residues in those situations. So there's a lot of ways that we can get exposure. Now, one concept, and this is one that the EPA really pushes, is what a hazard is. When is it hazardous? And hazard is actually a combination of two things. It's toxicity, how toxic that material is. And like I mentioned before, if you're working with a concentrate, that's going to be much more toxic than a dilute solution. And then the exposure. So if you're working with something that has low toxicity and high exposure, it's probably going to be a moderate hazard. Low toxicity, low exposure, it's going to be a low hazard. But when you start mixing, high toxicity and a moderate or a high exposure, you're starting to get a hazardous situation where you have high hazard with those situations. So keep this in mind. A lot of times when we work with more concentrated solutions, it's just for a very brief period of time. You're measuring, you're putting product into the spray tank. It goes in a minute or two and you're done and you clean up and now you're not working with that concentrated solution. when you work with a dilute solution, you may be exposed to it for hours. And so that's another thing to think about. Now, this is the equation that I mentioned that the EPA pushes. I don't like it because I think they're missing something in this equation. They should put time. So particularly if you're exposed over a short period of time, I think there's less hazard. When you have longer periods you're exposed, I think that hazard's going up. And particularly people that are making applications for hours or days at a time, that exposure's potentially much higher. So what is systemic injury? So that's where a pesticide, it gets into your skin, gets into your lungs, gets into your stomach, and it gets absorbed and it's distributed throughout your body. So that's not good. And, some of the symptoms that you can see from some products, again, it depends upon the product and it depends upon the person and the level of exposure, but you could have nerve damage. You could have inability for blood to form clots. It can increase some cancer rates. You can get reproductive problems, impaired metabolism, hormonal effects, and even damage to the liver or kidneys. So this is something we don't think about, allergic reactions. And this is when, you're exposed to something and your immune system becomes hypersensitive to it. And one thing I've seen in the last 10 or 15 years is we're starting to get more and more protein-based pesticides. And proteins have the potential for causing allergies. Think about, peanut allergies, for example. That's due to the proteins in peanuts. And so, particularly when you breathe in some of these proteins, you can have the potential for allergic reactions. And so that's something to think about. Some of the ways that this could show up would be skin irritation, blisters, hives, rash, itching in the eyes, even congestion. So skin exposure. And, studies have shown that 97% of all of our exposure to pesticides is through skin exposure. By the way, I don't know if you're familiar with it, but when they coat seed different colors, that means it's been treated with pesticides. So the person handling the seed here is, getting some skin exposure to pesticides. I don't know how serious it is, but it is skin exposure to pesticides. And these are different ways you can get the skin exposure. So sprays and dusts, get it on your skin, splashes, spills, all sorts of ways, hand labor, contacting plants that have been treated, contacting material and residues on equipment that you've just used. I don't know how many of you have had plugged nozzles when you're making applications. I've had plugged nozzles. I've had busted hoses. I've had hoses pop off backpack sprayers and drench my back. Fortunately, I've been wearing a Tyvek suit, but there's all sorts of ways that we can get skin exposure. I remember years ago, I was in Louisiana and they had a meeting in Louisiana, and it was a pesticide applicator meeting. And what they did is they didn't tell people, but they had a handout, and they coated that handout with a fluorescent dust. And then they turned on a UV light, and after people got the handout, you could see where their hands went. And it was actually pretty embarrassing for the people in the audience just to see what they were touching on themselves. But once you get something on your hands, you spread it all over your body, all over your face and other places. And you need to think about that when it comes to skin exposure. Even though their hands don't absorb pesticides as well as other places on your body, your hands are touching other places on your body. So if we think about some of that, about how different areas of skin absorb pesticides, you can see how that varies across the body. So, like I said, your palm, well, these are all relative areas, but, say 12%, forearm, 8%. But then you start to get up, your ear, 45% approximately, scalp, forehead, in the 30s, your groin area, it's 100%. So, some places that skin is able to absorb pesticides much better than others. And it's going to vary by the type of pesticide. It's going to vary by the person a little bit, but these are relative differences in that. So, eye exposure. A lot of times we don't think about pesticides getting in the eye. I actually work with a pesticide that causes irreversible eye damage. Basically, it's corrosive to the cornea. So it will cloud the cornea and you won't be able to see as well. How do I know that one has irreversible eye damage? I read the SDS sheet and it's right there. It's spelled out. It says causes irreversible eye damage. That's why it requires goggles on the label. And I tell you, when I see something like that, I don't want to lose my eyesight. I don't want to have impaired eyesight. When I use that product, I use goggles. I want to, when I retire, I want to be healthy. So be careful with some of these. Use the information that you have to make good decisions. So, breathing and inhalation, that's another route of exposure. Some pesticides are going to be more hazardous. When you're spraying things and they're in a fine mist, there's a higher likelihood you can breathe that in. If you're using a coarse spray, there's less chance of breathing that in. But once things get in the lungs, they're going to get into the bloodstream quite easily. Some pesticides on the label are going to require a respirator. And unlike COVID, there are requirements for these respirators. You have to match the respirator with the correct type of pesticides. Some are just, they filter particulates out of the air. Others are filtering organic vapors out of the air. So the requirements for pesticides will vary by the type of pesticide you're applying. Some pesticides, most pesticides do not require a respirator, but where they do require a respirator, you need to have a medical clearance and you need to have an annual fit test if you have one of these tight-fitting respirators, like what people are wearing for COVID. And the pesticides I use, I'm required to have a respirator, so I have to have that medical clearance every year, and I have to have that annual fit test. And you have to keep those records for 3 years. Swallowing pesticides, you think, well, what's the likelihood that I'm going to swallow a pesticide? And you think, it's not very common. But I showed you that example where someone's drink was right next to where they were spraying and filling containers. Here, this is an example. Someone's not using gloves at all. It's probably hot. What are they going to do before he sprays or just after he sprays? He may have a cigarette. He may drink something. He may eat something. And, those are residues on the hand, and they're going to get on whatever goes in the mouth unless the person uses proper hygiene and properly washes his hands off, washes his face before he smokes, eats, or drinks. And so there's a number of ways that can get in there. I have seen people that work for chemical company. Well, I saw one person working for a major chemical company had a plug in one of his nozzles. And what did he do? He stuck the nozzle in his mouth and he tried to blow that plug out of a nozzle. Again, that's a potential exposure where you're going to get residues in your mouth and in your stomach. So, what are the range of toxicities that we can have, or what do we see? There's a number of products where we're not going to see any effects, no immediate effects that are seen at all. You can have acute toxicity. This is usually where you see some effects within 24 to 48 hours. If it takes longer than 48 hours, we don't call that acute toxicity. Chronic toxicity, these are things that are delayed. They can be 48 hours, or they may show up in 25 years. But these are the long-term effects. And chronic toxicity can be from a single exposure, or it could be from a series or long-term exposure to a product. And then last could be death. And fortunately, we don't see that much at all in Kentucky. So just keep in mind when you're using different products, they have signal words on the containers, and they're basically three main signal words: danger, warning, and caution. Danger is the most hazardous, warning is moderate, caution is the lower hazard. And you can see how they come up with determining which signal word to put on the label. So for example, the oral LD50, this is how much you need to ingest to kill 50% of the test animals they're looking at. And you can see with the danger category, it doesn't take very much, only 50 milligrams per kilogram of test animal. So the smaller the number, the more toxic it is, the more hazardous. When you go to warning, you see how that number increases from 50 to 500. And then for caution, it's more than 500 milligrams per kilogram. And you can see it's not only just oral, how much you need to swallow, but inhalation, how much you breathe in, and they measure that in lethal concentration in the air. Dermal, how much on your skin, eye effects, and skin effects. And so they look at all these, and if any of these are in the danger category, you'll see danger on the label. If none of these are in the danger, then there's a possibility it could fit into the warning or caution. But you don't need all of these to be triggered. One of these can trigger, a higher signal word on the label. So chronic toxicity, just keep in mind that different pesticides cause different types of maladies or different types of problems. No one of them is going to cause all these, but some of the long-term effects we see from pesticide exposure could potentially be genetic changes, non-cancerous or cancerous tumors, infertility, miscarriages, birth defects, blood and nerve disorders, or hormonal disorders or diseases. These are the different signal words. When I use a new pesticide, the first thing I do is I look for the signal word. Since I'm an entomologist, I use a lot of insecticides. And I tell you, 30 years ago, when I started, saw a lot of products that had danger and poison on the label. Don't see that much at all. There's just a couple of products I use that are in the danger category, but most of the products now, fortunately, are more in the warning and caution area. But that is the first thing I check when I use a new pesticide. What is the signal word on that label? Also look to see if there's other things on there. Is it flammable? Why does that matter if it's flammable or not? Because that's going to determine where I store it. I'm not going to store it near a heater or other things that could potentially trigger a fire with that. Corrosive materials, explosive, and again, a lot of that is going to affect not only use of the material, but where we store that material. So I know it's probably very hard to see this, but this is a chart I put together, and it was just comparing different pesticides relative to, herbicides, fungicides, insecticides, as well as some household products there. Now, these are the LD50s, or the lethal dose. So the smaller the bar, the more toxic the product is. So big bars are potentially less hazardous. If you look at the second bar from the top, that's Roundup. So, a lot of people are concerned about Roundup in the news and lawsuits and like that, things like that. And just in terms of the LD50 with acute effects, it's not very toxic. If you look at some other things in there, the red bars are household products you're going to have around the house. That top red bar is actually white vinegar. And you think, well, that's crazy. White vinegar being toxic like that. Well, I have to tell you, what I looked at was the active ingredient, the acetic acid in the vinegar. And pure acetic acid is actually pretty toxic. And you can see what that looks like. Some of the other red bars we have down there, that would be Tylenol, aspirin, and Motrin. And when you look at the pure active ingredient in some of those products, they're actually pretty toxic. And they're compared to the pure active ingredient in some of those pesticides. And so the message here is, treat all products with respect. The dose makes the poison. And so, if you have 2 Tylenol, no, it's not going to hurt you. It's going to be helpful to you, in terms of helping you out with pain and other things. If you had 100 Tylenol at one time, yes, that is a problem. It is going to hurt you. And it's the same with pesticides. So you need to manage that exposure. You need to keep that dose down with these pesticides. So these are some of the pesticide poisoning symptoms that you can run across. So abdominal cramps, decreased consciousness, headache, confusion, rapid breathing, weakness, fatigue, change in lip or fingernail color, loss in appetite, weight loss. And I can go through all these, but think about how many other things these can be confused with. Some of these can be confused with, COVID symptoms, headache, anxiety, loss of strength and things like that. And so think about when you see some of these symptoms, you've been using pesticides a lot. Can it be due to some of the pesticides you've been using? If so, you need to get it checked out by a health professional. But there's lots of different potential symptoms. It's all going to depend upon the type of product you were using, the potential exposure you had, and to some extent, it can vary among people as well. So first aid for pesticide poisoning. Again, no one plans on getting pesticide exposure, but stuff happens over time. Skin exposure is going to be the most likely route of exposure with pesticides. Just remember, the faster you remove the pesticide from the skin, the less it's going to be absorbed, the less injury there will be. So if you do get pesticide on your skin, the first thing to do, wash it off with plenty of clean water. I always carry a little bit of soap when I'm applying pesticides, so I can wash it off. Use a paper towel, dry the area, and go on with that. If you get pesticides, particularly concentrates on your clothes, you need to get those clothes off and have a change of clothes that are free from some of the pesticide residues when you're dealing with concentrates. A lot of those clothes that have had concentrates on them, you need to get rid of those clothes. I wouldn't count on cleaning those in a washing machine. If you have eye exposure, you get blowback, you get concentrate in your eye, what you need to do is flush your eyes for 15 minutes. I'm out in the field where I don't have, an eye wash station. I carry a couple bottles of I wash saline with me. And so if something happens, I can flush out my eyes for 15 minutes. Once you get that done, you need to seek medical attention. Like I say, some of those materials can cause some eye irritation or long-term eye damage. You know, if people inhale pesticides and they're having problems, you know, we don't see this out in the field as much as we do in greenhouses and things like that. But someone has had inhaled pesticides, they're having symptoms, you need to move them into fresh air immediately. You need to get them out of that exposure. One thing to think about before you rush over there and start to drag the person out of the exposure is you need to protect yourself before you help someone else. What's worse than having one person down is having two people down. And so you need to make sure that you protect yourself before moving yourself into a situation like that. You know, if you have someone that swallowed some pesticides and they're having symptoms due to that, the first thing you need to do is read the label. Some labels will, you know, will recommend inducing vomiting. Other labels definitely tell you not to induce vomiting because that will cause more damage. So it's very much dependent upon the type of product and what's on that label. You know, if you don't induce vomiting, sometimes they'll recommend diluting that. And so, you know, milk or something else like that may be listed on the label. But, you know, in those situations, particularly with both inhaled and swallowed pesticides, you need to seek proper medical help with that from licensed professionals. So, you know, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but, you know, back in the day when we were using a lot of highly toxic insecticides, people that would use those all the time, we would actually recommend cholinesterase monitoring before and during the season. Fortunately, we're using a lot fewer of those products now. You know, what type of exposures are you likely to see? You know, we can see large, you know, short-term exposures. Those are the ones that are going to cause that more acute, immediate illness. But you know, we can also have those small, repeated exposures. You know, hooking up your equipment, you know, that may be contaminated, things like that. Those are small, repeated exposures. So another thing to think about is a lot of the signs of heat stress are going to be confused with some of the pesticide symptoms. And so, you know, make sure that you take care of yourself when you're out in the sun, you're out in the heat. This has been a tough year for heat. I know I've been out there, particularly when I'm wearing a spray suit, you know, keeping hydrated and just avoiding these other problems you can get that are related to the pesticide applications, particularly if you're wearing protective gear. You know, some of the symptoms you may be seeing may not be the pesticides, but it's a result of protecting yourself in the heat from the pesticides. So how do you avoid the risks from pesticide use? The first thing you need to do is read the label. If it's a new product, read that label. You may also want to read the SDS sheet. You should have those SDS sheets available as well. The section 2 of the SDS sheet gets into a lot of the health and safety issues associated with those products. You know, when you apply pesticides, you need to be aware of the situation. You need to be situationally aware. You need to be looking for other people, wildlife, pets that may be in the treated areas. And so not only do you have the responsibility of protecting yourself, but protecting others in those areas. safety first. Wear that PPE, wear those gloves, wear the long pants, the long shirt, shoes and socks. I would think that everyone has the common sense to wear shoes and socks when applying pesticides. I have been proven wrong. I saw someone making a termite application in a trench around a house, and he didn't want to get it on his shoes, so he took his shoes and socks off when he was doing that. And the last is use good hygiene. When you're done making a pesticide application, you need to wash your hands, wash your face, clean your personal protective equipment if it's reusable equipment, throw it away if it's single-use equipment, but use good hygiene when you're done. SDS sheets, I like looking at these for the new products, and you can see that section 2 lists a lot of the hazards with that. Some of the things that I didn't expect with just reading some of these. Some of these products are going to cause drowsiness and other things. And if you're using these all day and you're driving home at night, you need to think about what some of these potential effects are going to be of some of these pesticides. For applicators, you should have SDS available to you so you can review those. Keep in mind, we have lots of different application methods. Some of those are going to be higher exposure type methods than others. I know a lot of this is ag oriented, but the different methods we use, the different nozzles we use are going to determine, and the different pressures and things that we apply pesticides will impact the potential exposures. So the techniques where you might have higher exposure level, overhead applications are going to be much more potentially hazardous than things below your shoulder. If you're using a sprayer, air blast sprayer, or finer mist, those are going to have more potential exposure. And then you can see some of the other ag things. Many of you may be mixing adjuvants with your pesticides. So just keep in mind that not all adjuvants are the same. When you look at that pesticide label, you need to mix the proper adjuvant, a spreader, sticker, a penetrant with the proper pesticides. So some of these things like stickers are going to actually interfere with products that need to penetrate into the plant. So match them up carefully, and that way you can get these products to perform their best. We do have a Kentucky Pollinator Protection Plan. These are best management practices for beekeepers, for pesticide applicators, and landowners. And so that was ratified by our Commissioner of Agriculture back in 2019. So if you want to review it, it's available online at the Kentucky Department of Ag website. I'm actually a beekeeper. I was involved in the process, and I think it's a good tool to manage some of the effects on pollinators. So just for safety, some of the things you need to do. Any materials you use for measuring or handling pesticides need to be labeled as for pesticide use only. You need to store your products properly. And it's not only to protect you and the environment, but it's also to keep the products effective. You don't want them exposed to moisture. You don't want to have products exposed to high heat, freezing weather. All the storage requirements for each pesticide is going to be labeled. It's going to be at the end of the label there. And different products have different storage requirements. One thing I always like doing, because pesticides are expensive, Every time I buy a pesticide, I write the year on the container. And when I put it on the shelf, I put the new products behind the old products. So I use the old products first. Another thing the EPA doesn't tell people is they assume that people are not going to store pesticides for more than 3 years. So they assume that when they provide a label for a pesticide or approve a pesticide container, that it's only going to be on the shelf for 3 years. So when you purchase materials, think about that. Don't purchase some material or enough of a material where you're going to have that on hand for more than 3 years, because it may not perform the same after 3 years. And protect yourself. Look at the PPE section at the start of the label. Wear the proper protective equipment. Make sure it's not only you're wearing it, but you're using it properly, that you keep it in good condition, you keep it clean, and that's going to help to minimize your exposure. Transporting pesticides. We all transport pesticides. Don't transport these in the passenger compartment of the vehicle. Don't strap them into your child seat in the car so they don't fall over. That's a stupid idea. So put them in the bed of a truck, put them in the cargo compartment of the car, keep them away from household items, toys, groceries, that thing. If you put them in the bed of a truck, don't leave them unattended in the bed of the truck. Make sure that when you're driving around, that they can't slide and flip over in the truck. So they need to be tied down and contained. So, proper pesticide storage. If you do get inspected by the KDA, this is going to be one of the areas where they're going to look. They're going to see where you store your containers. That cabinet, that room, that building needs to be labeled to keep unattended people out. It needs to be locked. It needs to have good lighting. It needs to be uncluttered. The storage area needs to have an impervious floor and a sealed drain. It should have good ventilation and temperature control. And the other thing is you should have some spill control materials around there, because I can tell you from experience, you don't prepare, or you don't expect it, but you need to prepare for it. Spills will happen over time. If you do have a spill, think of the 3 C's. And when I had that container on that shelf that did rupture, I thought of those and it helped me. The first is control. So when I cut the bottom of that 2.5 gallon jug, it was leaking out the bottom. So I flipped the jug over. So immediately it's not leaking anymore. So I controlled the leak. The next is contain the spill. And so what I had at the time was a bunch of paper towels. So I put those on the shelf around it. So I controlled it. I contained it so it's not spreading any further. At that point, you can take a big sigh, a big breath of air. Things are not going to get worse quickly once you control and contain. Now you're in the cleanup mode. And that's where you use things, absorbent materials. We use a lot of kitty litter or floor sweep to pick up those materials. But there's other things, clay, newspaper, paper towels that you can use as well. And record keeping. Just keep in mind that we do have very specific record keeping requirements. You need to keep up with that. And we have to keep our records for 3 years, and that the USDA, EPA, or the KDA representatives have access to those records. So, and it's the Kentucky Department of Agriculture has been given the power by the EPA to regulate these pesticides. And with that, I have gotten to the end of my presentation.
I've got a question.
Sure.
On the record keeping, is that indicated on the pesticide you're using, of whether or not it would be the kind that would require record keeping?
Well, as a certified applicator, you're required to keep those records. So, you know, this is where there's EPA requirements, there's Kentucky Department of Ag requirements, and the Kentucky Department of Ag requirements are actually higher than the EPA requirements. The EPA only requires you to record restricted use pesticides if you're a certified applicator. The Kentucky requirements say restricted and general use pesticides as a certified applicator. So yeah, those are the requirements.